introduce tonight's speaker. Dr. Carolyn Finney is a writer, a performer, and a cultural geographer. As a professor in geography at the University of Kentucky, she is deeply interested in issues related to identity, difference, creativity, and resilience. In particular, she explores how issues of difference impacts participation in decision-making processes designed to address environmental issues. Dr. Finney is grounded in both artistic and intellectual ways of knowing. She pursued an acting career for 11 years, but a backpacking trip around the world and living in Nepal changed the course of her life. Motivated by these experiences, she returned to school after 15 years of what I refer to as experiential learning.
Yes, that's a nice way to put it.
To complete a bachelor's, master's, and Ph.D. Based on her dissertation research, she published her first book in 2014, Black Faces, White Spaces, Reimagining the Relationship of African Americans to the Great Outdoors. It's a great book. The aim of this book and her work more broadly is to develop greater cultural competency within environmental organizations and institutions, challenge media outlets on their representation of difference, and increase awareness of how privilege shapes who gets to speak to environmental issues and determine policy and action. She has served in numerous advisory roles, including being on the National Parks Advisory Board. As a national spokesperson, she is part of the Next 100 Coalition, a first-of-its-kind coalition of civil rights, environmental justice, conservation, and community leaders from around the country who advocate for greater inclusion of diverse communities in our country's national parks and other public lands. Dr. Finney is considered by many, including the president of the American Association of Geographers, to be one of the most influential geographers of our time.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. We had him at the recent SWAG conference. And
you just dropped that like it was hot.
She gives keynote addresses, distinguished lectures, and interviews to popular media outlets practically every week of the year. In fact, she arrived here in the wee hours of last night after doing an interview with a popular news outlet that I'm not allowed to mention yet. So, the reason Dr. Finney is in such high demand is due to the fact that her work is groundbreaking in a time where we need to disrupt some of our archaic practices and policies. We are very fortunate tonight to have Dr. Finney share with us her groundbreaking work. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Finney.
How do you get up after that? That was good. Okay, I'm a little flushed. Thank you. Actually, so first I want to thank, and I was thinking, I always think Julie and Jason too, because your emails like that is Julie coming. So Dr. J, the Dean, Joyce, Wilkerson, a lot of people who made it possible to bring me here. I'm kind of a pain in the butt when you're trying to email me and bring me in, so I know it takes time to get all the information you need. I'm psyched. I've never been to San Marcos. I've never been to Austin. I've never been to this part of Texas, so I'm psyched to be here. Thanks for coming out. Yeah, okay, we're going to do some things. So I'm actually going to be here, but I kind of like to come back to my notes to kind of keep me on track because I like to riff a lot. So about a year or two ago, I was at Yale University. A bunch of students asked me to come in and have a kind of similar conversation. They were thinking about race and the environment. Race, yeah, I said it, race and the environment. And at the end, somebody asked me, they said, you know, I understand why diversity and stuff is important, but really isn't it really about climate change? If we don't actually deal with climate change, you know, the earth and everything else, it's not going to matter about diversity. And I said, oh, really? I said, I got some things to say about that, because who's the we that's going to deal with climate change? And actually, if we don't have a relationship with each other, a good relationship with each other, how are we supposed to address those issues? Oh, yes, see, I'm already going off. Let me get my thing here. All right. Yeah, so I'm going to start up here. I don't know if you can see that. Yeah, okay, so it's coming up a little different. So it just says, what are we trying to sustain? So I want to tell a couple of stories in thinking about this issue. Climate change, is it climate change versus diversity? So this man is named Ian Gibson. I read about him, it's probably been about 2 years now. And probably the more famous story that a lot of us heard was about the American dentist who went sport hunting in Africa and killed the lion that was like the grandson of the famous lion or something. But right before that happened, this is what was in the paper. Ian Gibson's in his 50s, also a sport hunter. He had gone to South Africa. He was hunting elephants. He had some African guides with him, and he got too close to a boar elephant, a young elephant that had the tusks and gored him, and he died. It was in the newspapers, and I was online looking at it, and like you do when you're online, after you read the article, you then go down to the comments, and like 45 minutes later, you emerge, you feel dirty, you're like, what was I doing? Comments. By the time I got to the end of those comments, I was in tears, because the comments were brutal. There was only one comment that showed any compassion for him. The elephant won, he got what he deserved. It just went on and on and on about him. And so I asked the question about, what are we trying to sustain? Because actually I feel like I have nothing in common with this man except that we're human beings. He's a white man, I'm black. I don't support the idea of sport hunting. Elephants are one of my 2 favorite animals. But when I ask myself, I think about his death. That must have been a horrible way to go. He had family, he had community. I can't imagine in the last minutes of his life what he was feeling and thinking. And if I cannot have any compassion for this man, then what are we trying to sustain? What kind of conversation are we having? Because it isn't just about him. Yeah, he needs to take responsibility for some of the stuff that he did, but actually he's operating in a larger set of structures that made it okay for him to think it was okay to go out and sport hunt elephant. And actually, that's actually a more complicated conversation about conservation. Well, we won't go there, but I just want to throw that, bam, drop that, and then we can kind of move on. I put it up next to this photo. This is the photo of a young African-American boy. It was taken in relation to an article about Flint and the lead being put into the water, and just this whole question of people knew about it for 3 years. When I see this little boy, I don't have any problem feeling any compassion for him, in part because, we look similar. I think he's a child. What did he have to do with this? We don't even know the impacts that lead's going to have in his system over the course of years. We may not know for 20, 30, 40 years what kind of impact it had. But how did people think it was okay for there to be lead in the water all this time? So for me, the challenge for me personally is not him. The challenge for me is him. Because again, when we talk about the issue of sustainability, and sustainability as a word makes me crazy. Actually, yeah, it makes you crazy too, right? So if we went around the room and I asked all of you what you thought it was, we'd have at least 25, 30 different definitions of what that means. So I'm really interested in actually interrogating that idea, because for me, it's all about relationship. Not just relationship to non-human nature, but our relationship to each other. Yeah, that's right, okay. So now we got to go back a little further, and I'm going to tell some stories. I'm going to talk about the book, but I actually have to contextualize it a little bit. So I made this collage because I like to kind of put all these things up there because it's messy, and a lot of it is ugly, and a lot of it is stuff we don't want to talk about and we don't want to make visible, but it happens to be real. I think about transition, right? So for the last few years, we've been hearing a lot about in this country how we're all this transition in terms of diversity, and every time I hear it, it is really hard for my eyes not to roll back in my head. I mean, I understand what people are saying, but let me tell you something. The minute Christopher Columbus set his foot on this land, it became diverse. The conversation has been around a very long time. We got a lot more of us, and it's become more complicated, but this isn't a new conversation. I like to put this up here in the middle, because in the middle you have John Muir, President Roosevelt, 1903, Yosemite, overhanging rock. They're probably having some kind of deep conversation, right? Because these 2 men came up with this idea of national parks, which is complicated, right? But they came up with this idea of national parks. And I want to be really careful here, because, actually I don't want to be careful. I want to be really clear that I'm actually not interested in diminishing John Muir or his work. I think a lot of his passion is amazing. He had a commitment that was clear. No one can deny how committed this man was when it came to thinking about land and trees and wildlife and however you want to frame it. If you've ever read any of his writings, the man was also racist. In his own words, I'm not making this up, I'm not being dramatic, the way he talked about black people, the way he talked about American Indians, but he was a man of his time. I don't know, 1903, Jim Crow segregation. I mean, we can have a lot of conversations about it wasn't all on him, but it makes him complicated. For me, I don't want to have a conversation about John Muir and just about all the good things he does. I actually want to get at what makes him complex, which is that he could also be racist, he could love a tree, but he wouldn't necessarily love me the same way that he would love a tree, because this is really real, and he isn't the only one to feel that way. Same different Pinchot over there in the corner, who founded this idea of forestry. So I surrounded it with everything here. everything that was going on, from slavery to the issue of immigration. I was telling some folks earlier today, whenever we have a conversation about the national parks and public lands, and I love these all these things, but all that land was stolen, all of it. All of it. And I have it's hard for me. I've been sitting on the National Parks Advisory Board for 8 years. And I love the basic idea of the parks. I love the basic idea of it. And it's complicated because if I think of any American Indian person, whether I know them or not, that's a very different history for them. It's stolen land. How do we reconcile that? I'm not saying that we should give up those good ideas on national parks, but I'm saying it's complicated and we have to get better at holding that complexity if we really want to engage all kinds of people. There was something else I was going to say too. I'll come back to it. If I start doing this thing, then I'm all over the place. Black Lives Matter. No, I won't say that. So what are we trying to sustain? So I'm thinking about how we're going to engage this moment, right? All this is happening, all this that I don't have up there, the complications of it. I'm going to come back. So I always have to talk a little bit about myself. Because, in part, and in my defense, especially being in an academic institution, I believe all knowledge is subjective. We bring all of who it is we are to bear upon anything it is we're trying to understand. And I know that some people don't completely agree with that. They think that somehow we can step back. I can tell you I never had the privilege of doing that, and I certainly can't do that in a conversation about race and the environment, right? I can't take that. So it's important that I tell you a little bit about who I am and where I come from and how my ideas got shaped, because it's true for everybody, right? For me, this is personal. It's not simply an intellectual conversation. It is a personal conversation. So what I like to say, and I usually ask everybody, where you're from, and when somebody asks me where I'm from, I tend to get a little bit of an attitude. I'll be like, do you want to know where I live, or do you want to know where I'm from? And people are just like, what's her problem, right? And I say, because I'm from New York, even though I haven't lived there in a really long time. I told these are my parents in the corner, Rose and Henry. Rose and Henry grew up in Floyd, Virginia, a little tiny town not too far from the Blue Ridge Mountains. They grew up poor. They both had a 12th grade education, grew up in very big families. My dad went off and fought in the Korean War. When he came back from the Korean War in the 50s, like a lot of black folks, he said to my mom, let's move north and see if I have some better job opportunities. He told me a story now a few years ago how he said when he came back, he saw a park ranger in a park ranger uniform. He thought it looked like a really good government job. And when he went to ask about that, they said, yeah, but we don't hire Negroes, right? So for a long time, he's held a very particular negative idea about the national parks. So they went to New York. My father had 2 job offers. One, he could be a janitor in Syracuse, New York, which is about 5 hours north of New York City. And the other was about 30 minutes, right outside of New York City in Westchester County. You used to have a very wealthy Jewish family called the Tishmans. There's the Tishman building. They used to own what's now the Kushner building, Rockefeller Center. They own a lot of real estate. They had a 12-acre estate 30 minutes outside of New York City. Swimming pool, lake, vegetable gardens, fruit trees. You can see some of the pictures of that estate. They needed full-time caretakers for that estate, a chauffeur, a gardener, a part-time housekeeper. That's the job my parents took. What I always like to say is, that's the gardener's cottage. I'm going to show you a picture later of the big house, what I call the big house. They didn't call it the big house. My parents wanted to have kids, and they thought they couldn't have kids, so they adopted me. And then what I like to say is that they relaxed, and they had my first brother, and relaxed some more, and they had my second brother. The Tishmans only came up on weekends and holidays. This is a very wealthy white neighborhood. And when I say very wealthy, Harry Winston had property down the street. Schaefer of Schaefer Beer was next door. Schaefer Beer is not very good, but Schaefer Beer lived next door. Wingfoot Golf Club is around the corner. We were the only family of color, period, in that neighborhood until the 1990s, when a Japanese-American woman moved in across the street. She was there a few years, and then she moved out. Because the Tishmans weren't there on weekends and holidays, it was like me and my brothers, it was like playing in the park, right? We were out there all the time. We all learned to swim by the time we were 6 or 7 on that property, so that myth that black people can't swim is just a myth. In part because my parents couldn't always watch us, and it was a 12-acre property, so they wanted to make sure if we fell in, we'd be able to save ourselves. The story that I like to tell in terms of thinking about the color of my skin and living in this neighborhood is when I was 9. I was walking in from school and went to a public school. there in Mamaroneck, and I was coming home, so I was right around the corner from the house. There's always cops patrolling this neighborhood because of all the wealth. I had a little afro, a little school bag, not very impressive. I'm right around the corner from the house. The cop stops me. He said, "Where are you going?" I say, 1,000 Old White Plains Road. And he said, "Oh, do you work there?" And exactly, I'm thinking I'm 9. Dude, really. But I'm not saying any of that, right? I'm 9. And I got confused, and I just said, "No, I live there." And then I kind of went home. I told my parents. My father called the police station. He gave them holy hell. And they never bothered any of the kids again. But when I think about that and look back on that as an adult, I'm saying all the logics. What was happening at that moment to that man? That he saw a little girl, the time of day, coming in from school, that he imagined the only way that I could be in that neighborhood is that I must have been working there. And I sort of hold that. I want to jump ahead a little bit to, what else do I want? Do I want to talk about the 90s? Yeah, I do a little bit. So I call him Mr. and Mrs. Tishman. That's a whole psychological issue that we can't really go into. Mr. Tishman died in the 60s. He used to have a silver Rolls Royce that my father used to drop me and my brothers off at elementary school with. And I understood that when he told me that years later because I didn't remember it. But from 4th grade till high school, Marion Mitchell and Darlene Robinson used to beat my butt on a regular basis because they thought I was better because I lived on the hill and as black girls, they lived in the working area of Mamaroneck. And that's an issue. The race and class thing is really complicated. And at 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, I don't have the words to explain to them, why we're living at the top of the hill, not because we think you're better, or the questions of you think you're white, all of these things that would come. This conversation goes on all the time until I slapped Marion Mitchell, and that's another story. The last thing that I want to say for now about this is that in the 1990s, so Mrs. Tishman is sick, and my parents have been on this land at this point almost 40 years. And she's got to think about what's going to happen to my family because she's clearly she doesn't know how much longer she has. Now, Mrs. Tishman and my father had a very close relationship. What I never say in front of my father that it was like driving Miss Daisy, like Morgan Freeman and driving Miss Daisy because he would get very upset. And he kind of looks like Morgan Freeman, but he always says to me, so my father works at Costco now. He's 85, 86. He shouldn't be working, but that's another story. He takes your receipt when you leave Costco, and people always come and be like, "You look like Morgan Freeman," and he says to them, "Morgan Freeman looks like me." So she had my father by her bedside when she died. So it's complicated, the relationship. But to her credit, she really wanted to think how to keep my parents on this land. In the 90s, this property was worth over $3 million. The property taxes alone were $125,000 a year. My dad had been making something like $20,000, something in that realm, right? So there was no way they could stay on that property. And so in the end, she had a house built for them in Leesburg, Virginia, in part because my youngest brother, who was now married with kids, was the only one who was kind of settled in a place. Me and my other brother were moving around. My father said he would never go back to the state of Virginia, because he has a lot of anger towards that state and his experience growing up there. But the house is beautiful. It's an old town in Leesburg. It's got about ½ an acre of land. Mrs. Tishman passed away. A new owner came on. My parents stayed on another 5-6 years. So now they're in their 70s. Yeah, they're in their 70s at this point because they've got to get a new family to care for this property. So now they have a family from Central America, actually, who takes care of the land. 2003, they moved down finally to their beautiful house in Leesburg, and my parents, but particularly my father, ever since has been depressed. All he talks about is the land and New York, and that was his home. And that's the moment, and I was working on my Ph.D. when I started thinking about issues of race and environment in this country and whose story counts. How quickly they've been on that land 50 years. They knew it better than anybody else because they work it day in and day out, right? But they have no claim over it. And then I started thinking about the history of this country and all the people that are simply invisible, right, who've been there, who can tell you a lot about the land. I don't care if it's parkland, forest land, if it's the water or the beach, I don't care what it is, but they have been there all along, right? They have a story to tell. They don't always need to learn from those of us who think we know more. We have something actually to learn from them and how to make the story visible. So I'll come back to that a little bit later. That's the big house. You can see it in front of the swimming pool. Yeah, I said that with emotion and stuff. Okay, so that's my metaphorical afro. And I always change it up in terms of who I put up there. And sometimes I'll put all African Americans, but the truth is there are a lot of different people who influence the way that I think. So I've got Carl Sagan up there, and Albert Einstein, and Moms Mabley, and Alice Walker, and a lot of other people. And I kind of just wanted to say that, but just so you know, I actually did have an afro. I call this radical presence, and in part because, I've been challenged in talking about African Americans, my viewpoint about African Americans as it relates to environmental issues. I feel like nobody wants to be primarily defined by the fact they have been victimized. It doesn't mean they haven't been victimized, but actually I really wanted to look collectively at African Americans and think about their resilience, that it's somehow radical, that despite years of being told you don't belong, and if you do belong, you're not really human anyway, whether it's through our policies, our regulations, our cultural beliefs, it goes right down to our language, light and dark. We just still do it all the time. And despite that, how radical it is to show up and fight for a land that arguably never loved you in the first place, but you're willing to fight for it anyway. So if you haven't heard of Ron Finley, isn't that a cool picture? Ron Finley, he said that, you ain't gangsta unless you're planting something. So he's out in LA, he said he plants on highway medians anywhere that he can find soil and the ability to do it. He doesn't play by the rules because the rules don't always recognize him anyway. Jack Andraka, Jack Andraka, has anybody heard of Jack? Okay, there was one. So Jack, it's got to be about 3 years ago now. He was 16 years old. At this moment on YouTube, he just won the largest science prize in the country, $100,000 Intel Science Prize. It's a great little video if it's still up because he's so amazed that he actually won. And I loved watching him find out he wins his prize. But the reason I want to put this up here is because he was on 60 Minutes. I want to get the quote right. And this was when Morley Safer was still alive. And Morley Safer was talking to him and commenting about how smart he had to be. So what he won it for was, he had recently had a relative who had died from pancreatic cancer. He was sitting in 5th period biology. He wasn't paying any attention to his teacher. But he came up, one of the reasons he had thought that we couldn't catch pancreatic cancer and do anything about it on time is because there was no early detection program. So he said, I'm gonna come up with an early detection, something. So he came up with something, a proposal. He took it to his parents. He was like, could you send this out to some labs? They thought he was a little nuts, but they said, we'll do it for you. They sent it out to 200 labs. 199 turned him down. Somebody from Johns Hopkins said, you have a good idea. So this is what he won it for. So when Morley Safer said, you gotta be, how smart you must be, this is what Jack said. He said, I don't think it's that I'm really smart. I know people who are way smarter than me. You could be a genius. But if you don't have the creativity to put that knowledge to use, then you just have a bunch of knowledge and nothing else. He said that when he was 16, folks, right? He understood right away the power of creativity and what you have to have. Nikki Giovanni, African-American poet who's been honored in many ways for her work. I heard her speak maybe about 4 or 5 years now ago in Oakland, California. And one of the things she said that stuck with me, she said, sailors can read the stars, farmers can read the soil. We have to learn how to read different literacies. So what does this mean in this larger conversation about race and the environment? What does it mean to learn different literacies? And yes, because I love me some Jackie Moms Mabley. Jackie Moms Mabley, especially for a lot of younger folks who don't know who she is or who she was, she came out of vaudeville. This woman was an African-American comedian, 40s, 50s, and 60s. This is what she looks like, but this is what she would do when she was on stage. She'd take her teeth out, she'd put on a schmata and a hat, she'd stand in front of predominantly white audiences in the 40s and 50s and 60s, and she'd talk about race. Now I just want you to, so she was Jim Crow, civil rights. She's standing in front of audiences and she's telling them her truth about race, right? And the audience loved her. She got invited to the White House. They loved her. And so a couple of years ago, Whoopi Goldberg did a documentary on her, and they got some contemporary comedians like Arsenio Hall, and they were asking him, how did she get away with that? And Arsenio Hall said, well, she was sneaking it through the back door. So I always think a lot, what does that mean in having these conversations? How are we creative? How do we sneak it through the back door? How do we use what we have at our disposal? So now I'm going to talk a little bit about stuff from the book, some stories. I got to give you, for me, the book was, it was personal as well as in a sort of an intellectual exercise I had to do. And in part, I spent a lot of time pushing back on what was expected in terms of how I write the book. Right, we can kind of come back to that. But one of the things I did on purpose was I named a lot of the chapters after Spike Lee movies. And I did that on purpose because I felt that, Spike Lee, in terms of culture and black culture through his work in film, has a lot to say about that. So I entitled the first chapter Bamboozled. Bamboozled, he was talking about the media and the way we've been bamboozled in terms of thinking about African American stereotypes. It's not what I'm talking about, but I think we've been bamboozled in terms of thinking about the dominant narrative about environment and land in this country. We've been bamboozled. That's why I put all that up there with that one for whites only. So, do you ever see the movie Far and Away with Tom Cruise, Nicole Kidman? It's okay. Okay, but it is a story about Irish immigrants. Nicole Kidman plays a wealthy Irish immigrant in the 1800s. Tom Cruise is a poor one. The movie starts off with Tom Cruise's father dying and saying that the most important thing is land. And so they both come over to the United States at that time and try to find land. It's probably the last 20 minutes of the movie I find really interesting because it's about what it must have looked like when the Homestead Act was passed and the gun went off at midnight. Now, I never thought about the Homestead Act before I started doing this work. I could have told you what the Homestead Act was 15 years ago. Now I think it is one of our most important pieces of legislation. 1862, that gun goes off at midnight. If you were a European immigrant, and yeah, a couple other folks slid up in there, but mostly, if you were a European immigrant, that gun goes off, you go out, you can put a stake down on 100 acres of land, 120 acres of land. All you had to do for 5 years is stay on that land, farm, build a home, and survive. If you did, that land was yours, free and clear. Now, I just need you to hold that for a second, because there is nowhere in the world anymore, at any time, can anybody get land for free, let alone 120 acres of land. That's incredible for me. And land isn't only about land, it is about economic and political power, it is about legacy, right? Now, I'm not diminishing the experience of European immigrants. Something like 60% of them didn't make it. I can't imagine how hard it was. I can't imagine how hard it was for many of them to leave the land that they were born on to come over here and take a shot at it. If you got a cold, you could die. Your closest neighbor could be 100 miles away. So I have no doubt it was hard. And I also have to think about that before they could get that land free and clear, all the native people on that land had to be removed, killed, or removed in order for that to be possible. That's also true, right? How do we hold that? I think about 3 years later, so 1862, 1865, the Emancipation Proclamation, enslaved Africans are freed. They're given 400,000 acres of land. Then some white plantation owners kind of freaked out because they said, we just gave land and economic and political power to a whole bunch of people that are probably going to be pissed off because we kind of kept them up in chains, like property for all those years. We can't do it. Let's take it back. Right? I can't imagine the whiplash that must have happened on everybody going, whoa, no, we can't do it like that. That's what 40 acres and a mule is actually about. But they can't, most of them can't participate in this, right? So if you just look at the beginning, one of the beginnings of that conversation, this dominant conversation about just that immigrants came over and built, and there was a lot of other things happening at the same time, and it wasn't the same for everybody. I know everybody's giving me the serious look. I know, I'm going to tell some funny stories really soon. The second chapter is Jungle Fever, and yes, it was after Spike Lee. He's talking about interracial relationships. And I'm talking a little bit more about how I feel like black people in particular have been constructed in relation to nature here in this country. So this is Vogue, 2010. It's the first time an African-American man has been placed on the cover. It's LeBron James with the supermodel Gisele Bündchen. When this came out, if you're wasted time like I did looking on the internet, what people were saying, a lot of black people were upset. They were upset because they said, you finally put a black person on the cover, a black man on the cover, and why is he looking all primitive and almost like a gorilla? And then somebody uncovered this. This poster is from 1917. I want you to just look at it. The color isn't great here, but her dress is the exact same color as her dress. They're both green. So when the editors of Vogue, somebody showed them that poster and said, you know, what's happening? And over here, with over here. They said they didn't know anything about this. Now, yeah, that's what I did too. I laughed as well. But for me, that wasn't even the point, because it says something about what's embedded in our consciousness, primitive, something that's problematic. I think about the World's Fairs in 1800s and early 1900s. The World's Fairs in this country were supposed to be about how we could be better, we were going to become more civilized, what we could move forward to. Except that they were also putting black and brown people on display as the very thing that we should want to move away from. I think about Ota Benga, who I believe was only 19 when he was discovered in the Congo. He was brought back. He was put on display at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, which is my favorite museum. That's the museum I grew up in. And then the museum owners thought, well, you know, enough people aren't going to see him, so we're going to move him to the primate exhibit at the Bronx Zoo until enough people. And the problem is, there's a lot of these stories. They're not pretty, they're not nice, but they're true, right? So this link to what's natural and the primitive, all this language we often use when we're talking about non-human nature in this country becomes complicated for many people, particularly for brown folks. I was telling some folks today that I, you know, as a brown girl, you know, I grew up in a household that understood what the Civil Rights Act meant, just from a practical on the ground perspective, with black parents who had to work a lot of jobs to do what they were doing to raise us. I'd never heard of the Wilderness Act. Nobody in my house ever talked about the Wilderness Act. I never thought about the Wilderness Act until I started doing this work. And then I discovered, someone told me that both those acts, those pieces of legislation, happened in the same year, 1964. And so I read a little bit of both of them because I thought that's pretty incredible. So Howard Sennheiser and his group were sitting down, coming up with, you know, these really heartfelt things we should be thinking about in terms of conservation and preservation, and the people who were doing the work in the Civil Rights Act. And they were not talking to each other. And actually, if you read it, it's really interesting, right? Particularly for the Wilderness Act, they use a lot of universal language. And what I mean by that is just this idea, here's what we should be doing and how we should be interacting with this. They were writing this at a time that Jim Crow was still in place. Let me tell you something. It don't matter if it's a pretty tree. It doesn't matter if it's a nice woods or if it's a nice beach. Do you think that racist men's, because we're in the park now, you know, and I'm making fun on purpose because it doesn't. But it was really interesting to me how there was kind of a separate conversation, if we're going to talk about the environment as this thing over here, that's really different from those like other social issues over here. And I'm like, they're never different. They're always like this. We have to have that conversation. When I was writing this, a friend of mine from Canada sent me an article to make my point. And she talked about a white professor, and I'm just blanking on his name, who was at Boston College, I believe. This was late 50s, early 60s. There was an African-American couple that he was friends with who wanted to go to the national park, but this was late 50s, early 60s, United States. So he said, well, let's go over the bay into Canada. Let's go to Fundy Bay National Park. But he said, let me write the superintendent, let him know I'm bringing this African-American couple. He wrote and said, you know, these two are very educated. You know, I want them to be treated with respect, so on and so forth. He had to wait a while. When he got the response back, the superintendent said, I'm really sorry, but I can't promise you anything because we get a lot of American visitors. The couple was Dr. Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King, who wanted to take a break from their civil rights work to be in the woods. You may be right. Have that spiritual connection that Howard Sennheiser and his buddies are talking about. They couldn't even do it safely, right? So we can try not to have these as separate conversations, but the thing I guess I want to say about it is that they're always intertwined and show up in one form or another. Yeah. 40 acres and a mule. Just kind of what I always say is I like that picture of Tupac. So one of the things in talking to African Americans around the country was what came up over and over again, particularly with older African Americans, was the power of memory. And so, you know, this idea that memory, either sort of collective memory of black community in a place, or the individual memory. And so a personal story that I like to tell. So 2005, I was living in Atlanta. I was writing this up as a dissertation. And I got my parents to come visit me, which was a task in and of itself. And I thought, because I knew my father was having this thing with the National Park Service, because we never went to any national parks for a variety of reasons, when I was a kid, I said, we're going to do like the Black National Park thing, because we're going to go to Martin Luther King National Park. And if you've ever been, it's right in downtown Atlanta, and people live on that street. There's Ebenezer Baptist Church, the house Dr. King grew up in. There's a visitor center. And when we got to the visitor center, my mom must have wandered off, but if you've ever gone, anybody ever go to that exhibit? Been there, right? If it's still like a diorama, like you walk in, there's all these images from the 50s and 60s. There's sounds and voices coming over a loudspeaker of Dr. King and other people talking. There's a jail cell, a replica of the jail cell Dr. King must have been in. There's life-size images of people marching. So the feeling is that you're just attacked. Like, this is what it feels like. So my dad, who's really old school, stoic, black man, shows no vulnerability, serious. I was scared of him as a child. I mean, in that way that you're scared of him as a child. He didn't do anything bad. He was just hard. He was standing next to me, and suddenly, I'm gonna borrow your arm just for a second, and suddenly he just grabbed my arm like this. Now, you know, if I had been like 10, I'd been like, I did something wrong again, right? But I'm grown, right? So I looked over at him, and he had blanched. And the thing that I thought that had happened was that he was having a heart attack. Right, like, split second right after that, he giggled, and I tell people, like, that freaked me out even more. And then he pointed at a sign, and the sign was a whites only sign, a replica of a whites only sign. He pointed to the sign, he said, I saw that sign, and for a minute, I thought we weren't supposed to be here. Right. And that, I've told that story 100 times, and I'm always moved by it, because he became very vulnerable in that moment, right? And he was grabbing me to think, we need to, you know, get out of here. And then he got really uncomfortable, obviously, when he realized what just happened to him. So I think about memory also as a thing that we carry around. Consciously, unconsciously, informs what we believe is possible for ourselves, how we move through space, how we move through different kinds of spaces. The thing that's really important for me to say, so you might think, so, oh my God, it didn't work, so he had this terrible experience in the National Park. Quite to the contrary, right? Then we went on a tour of on the house Dr. King grew up in, and park rangers are some of the most amazing storytellers that I've ever experienced, and this young white man was just amazing, and my father was so deep in it. At the end of the day, my father said that was such a great experience. I didn't think I was going to have a good time, and I realized that it's not about feeling good. It was actually, he felt fully seen. So he had this emotional experience that surprised him. And that made him actually more, like, it was seen and I could understand. He's like, wow, I didn't even know that was still in me in that way. And we were having a conversation about it and how important that is. Oh, what just happened? Okay, sorry about that. And I do want to talk a little bit about memory, that African Americans, some that I met, use memory as a way that informs their environmental activism. That's a nice way to say it. So have any of you heard of the Beach Lady? Maureen? A few people? Anybody? You ain't leaving. Okay, got to do some homework. So Maureen, for me, is one of the most amazing people I have ever met, and I don't say that lightly. A lot of people haven't heard of Maureen Betch. A lot of people in academia have heard of her sister, Jonetta Cole, who is a well-known academic. Maureen, and Jonetta, I guess, as well, but Maureen grew up in a very wealthy black family in the 30s, 40s, and 50s on Amelia Island. And Amelia Island is right off the coast of Jacksonville, Florida. Maureen's great-grandfather, A.L. Lewis, was the first man, black or white, to have a life insurance company in Jacksonville in the 40s. So he made a lot of money, but they were still black, which meant that if you were black, you couldn't go to the beach where white people were going. So A.L. Lewis thought, we can't go to your beach? I'm gonna just buy a beach. So he bought a strip of beach on Amelia Island. It's called American Beach. You could be a black janitor, you could be a black judge, but you could have a house, you could have a modest home on the beach. You could bring your family to the beach. This is where Maureen grew up, as the sand dunes in the background. Maureen went to Oberlin College, then decided she wanted to be an opera singer, so then she went to Germany, and she had some success. She was there for quite a while. And sometimes in the 70s, she became interested in environmental causes. First, she was a patron for a man who was studying the monarch butterfly. She would give money to people who were working with pygmy communities in parts of the African continent. And she came back to the United States, and then she decided to give all her wealth away to environmental causes. She gave it all, she didn't keep like $5. She gave it all away. The house that she was living in had been her great-grandfather. She gave it away to environmental causes. She was living on a chaise lounge on the beach. I asked Maveen, I said, weren't you scared? Maveen said, I had a big stick. Her sister bought her a trailer, which she moved into, and then she promptly turned it into a kind of museum so that people would come in. Then she turned her attention to what was happening locally. So Amelia Island, American Beach on Amelia Island sits in between two beach resorts. Fernandina Beach Resort on one side, Amelia Island Plantation, yes, I said it, that's what they call it, on this side. And developers were just, drooling, because you had the maritime forest there, beachfront property. They tried to get in there, and Maveen was like, I'm not having it, we've got to fight that. Because it wasn't just about the maritime forest and the beach, it was also about the African-American history in that place. So the story I always tell is Maveen going to civic meetings, right, and raising Cain when she got there. What you can't tell very well in this photo is that, you see how she's carrying that thing under her arm? That's her dreadlocks. They're so long that she'd wrap them up and carry them under. So Maveen would tell me she would go to a civic meeting, and she'd stand in the back like nobody saw her. And they would do the Pledge of Allegiance. And so they'd say, I pledge of allegiance to the flag, to the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice. And then she said, I'd shout out at the top of my lungs, for all white people who got money! And all. And then she'd be like, oh, they see me now. They saw you earlier. She got the Park Service to protect 8.2 acres of the sand dunes. It's a National Historic Site, so it's protected when you go in there. The problem is people can still come in and build super large houses. So some of the nature of that place has changed a little bit, but the memory is preserved in there in a particular way. Maveen told me, she said, I am the freest person you will ever meet. She said, because when I walked away from the money, I was able to do exactly what I wanted to do. Now, I've been having this conversation, telling this story for probably 3 years and in front of predominantly white audiences. So few times has anybody have heard of who she is. And I've asked people, environmental organizations in particular, why aren't we telling this story? This is a crazy story of commitment. And a few people have said to me, a lot of it has to do with, this makes them really uncomfortable, right? This is not necessarily what we think of somebody as an environmentalist or conservation and giving away everything that they have. I talk a lot about the issue of representation and the images that we see, and I want to sort of tell a little story about John Francis, because for me this is a big part of it. I like to tell stories because it's all those things that bleed into our consciousness, what images we see, who's telling us these things, whose experiences are prioritized, what stories become invisible. I love me some John Francis. He's beautiful. You should have him here for Anyway, you should. That's great. John Francis, in the 70s, he was living in Northern California. There was an oil spill. John got really upset by that oil spill, so he decided, I'm not taking any kind of transport. I don't know how long I'm doing it for, but I'm just going to walk or something. He said after about a week or two, he was getting in arguments with all his friends because, he'd be walking into town, they'd pull up in their truck, they'd be like, you have to get in, he'd be like, no. And when your friends do something different than you, and that kind of messes with your stuff for a while, and he said, I'm just not going to talk about it anymore. So John spent the next 22 years walking across the US and Latin America to raise awareness about the environment. He did it for 17 years without talking. He got his Ph.D. at the University of Wisconsin-Madison without talking. Okay, I just want you, students, faculty with your degrees, I can't not talk for 5 minutes, okay? So he went through his entire dissertation without talking. When he was talking again, and still only riding his bike and walking, is when Exxon Valdez happened. When Exxon Valdez happened, that spill in 1989 at that time, there was no one who had done a dissertation on oil spills except for John Francis. So he was working on somebody's boat in New England somewhere. He got a call from some folks in Washington. They said, you need to come down and interview for this job. You got to help us think about this. He's like, yeah, I'll come down and interview this. We'll send you a plane ticket. He says, I don't take the plane. They were like, well, you send us a train. I don't take the train, bus, no, none of it. They were like, well, how are you going to get here? And they were like, well, I'm going to ride my bike. Well, how long is that going to take? They were like, he's like a month. They waited, he rode his bike, he got the job. He's one of the original architects of our original oil spill policy. John said when he was walking, would walk with his banjo. And somebody from National Geographic had approached him sometime, I guess, back in the 90s, saying this would be a great story to have in National Geographic. And it would be, right? Because if you read National Geographic, people are always doing some crazy stuff, right? They're taking a boat around the world, they're caving or whatever they're doing, right? So the guy said, I will have to go take it to the board. And about a week later, John said the guy came back to him, head kind of hung down, and said that he had taken it to the board, but basically they didn't want to do the story. And John understood that they didn't want to do a story about a crazy black man walking across the country for 22 years to raise awareness about the environment, 17 years without talking. So what they did is they placed it, if you go to the back of National Geographic on the last page, there'll sometimes be a little story about somebody there. So when you think about representation, so he's doing all this, right? He's doing all this for years and years and years. In early 2000, he started an organization called Planet Walk. He takes groups of people to Cuba, had satellite systems set up, so school kids in Cuba could talk to school kids in the United States about sustainability. He decides he's going to write a book about his life, because that's kind of incredible, right, story. He couldn't find anybody to publish it, because it's such a common story about a black man spending 22 years walking across the US to raise environmental awareness, 17 years without talking. But this is where people have a chance to make a different choice. National Geographic found the book, came to him, said, we'd actually like to republish it under our label. He's now a National Geographic Fellow. They sent him to China and all these other places to have this conversation. Hollywood bought the rights to his story. I got very excited because for a while there he was talking about Will Smith playing him, but I got even more excited because then he was talking about Morgan Freeman's going to be my dad. I was like, I'm going to be there serving coffee. Now it's Chiwetel Ejiofor. I heard that for a while after 12 Years a Slave. They still haven't done anything about it, but often when I tell audiences this, they say, oh, Hollywood's going to mess it up, right? Because Hollywood doesn't always messes up these kinds of stories. And I said, I'm sorry. When is the last time you've seen a movie about a black man who spent 22 years walking across the US to raise environmental awareness, 17 years without talking? I don't care who makes the movie, right? Because what I'm interested in is what happens when we get a room full of people who come to see Will Smith or whoever's playing that, but what they'll also see is somebody who looks like this, whose commitment is 100%. John is close to 70 now, so now he's talking, and he was given a Prius by the people who bought the rights to his story. But what a thing. It kind of changes the depiction of who we think actually cares, who's actually engaged, and who actually has some different ideas about how we might move forward. Okay, we're getting there. Am I watching time? Not really, but we're almost there. Okay, we don't have to, you can ask me questions. This is like when we have to talk about perceived racism. I am totally comfortable with it. I'm just worried about time, but you can ask me about this. Yeah, you can ask me about it. I'm going to go to the end. In the last chapter, and for me, I have to, as a black person doing this work and thinking about this work, I talk a lot about what it means also to be me doing it. This isn't something separate from it, because I actually have had my own challenges in larger spaces around how I have this conversation and who gets to have this conversation and why it's important. And when the book came out, it had to be peer reviewed. And in an academic sense, that means that you get a couple of anonymous reviewers who make comments. As it was, I figured out who the two guys were. One let himself know that it was him. The other was kind of shocked when I went, ah! And he went, ah! And I was like, okay. Because the universe has a sense of humor, one was black and one was white. I admire both their work and who they are and what it is that they do. But it was interesting about some of the comments, and one in particular was, after the first round of comments, the white reviewer came back to me and said, can you do a whole chapter on how afraid black people are about when it relates to the environment and conservation? Now, all these stories I just told you, a lot of them are in there. Like I said, well, actually, I talk about them, and it really was disturbing for me. And I didn't know why. It took me about a month or two to really sit with it and say, in the end, it's because I didn't want to tell a story about how afraid we've been. This isn't about that. So, does anybody have a copy of my, this is a kind of weird thing to ask, because I usually have a copy. I know you do. Priscilla, I know her. Yay. Because this is what I usually do, is I just want to, I spent about, thank you, I just spent a page and a half talking about our fear, but I want to read, conclusion. Hold on, I'm sorry, I was better prepared. All right. So, yeah, I spent not even a page. I spent about a page. But it's a paragraph from somebody named Dr. Joy DeGruy Leary, who wrote something called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. So I just copied it because I just thought it was so wonderful the way she put it. She said, 180 years of the Middle Passage, 246 years of slavery, rape, and abuse, 100 years of illusory freedom, black codes, convict leasing, Jim Crow, all codified by our national institutions, lynching, medical experimentation, redlining, disenfranchisement, grossly unequal treatment in almost every aspect of our society, brutality at the hands of those charged with protecting and serving, being undesirable strangers in the only land we know. During the 385 years since the first of our ancestors were brought here against their will, we have barely had time to catch our collective breath. That we are here at all can be seen as a testament to our willpower, spiritual strength, and resilience. And I said, that's it, that's all I'm gonna talk about, the fear. I said, so one of the last stories I wanna tell you is one of those stories about resilience. Oh no, but pretend I didn't show you that yet. Okay, I'm gonna skip that. And I wanna talk about Brenda Palms Barber. So Brenda Palms Barber was living in Denver. This is probably now about 15 years ago. She got a call from some folks in Chicago who said, we've got a lot of previously incarcerated black men and women. They come out of jail, they can't get a job. Can you come here and think of like a good idea? And she said, work with us on that. She said, oh, I'll do that. And she said she sat around people they thought about, maybe they could drive around the elderly, they could do landscape gardening, there's all this kind of stuff, but it didn't seem that it would be long-term, it would be such a great thing. Then she had a random conversation with a friend. It was not even about this. And the friend brought up beekeeping. They were just talking about it. And she went, that's what we're going to do. We're going to make urban honey on the west side of Chicago. And you can imagine a lot of people thought she was a little bit crazy. Like, you want to make honey in Chicago? Whatever, okay. She got beekeepers to volunteer their time. She got some funding. In the end, she created a very successful business called Sweet Beginnings, which makes honey and honey-related products. You can get it at Whole Foods, and you can get it at Chicago O'Hare Airport. It's kind of everywhere. A couple of things about the business. This woman never thinks about herself as an environmentalist, to have anything to do with conservation. She had to learn about the life cycle of the bee. In order to understand the business, she did this intuitively. She just and everybody who gets hired here has to understand the life cycle of the honeybee and why it's so important. She would tell me that when she would interview young men and women for the job, I like you, so I'm gonna come back to you again. You don't have to do anything. It's not that I don't like you, but I'm just saying, and she would say, so you're looking for a job? And the young man would say yes. And she said, so you're in jail. You were in jail. And he'd say, yeah, I was in jail. And she said, well, what were you in jail for? And usually they'd say, I was selling drugs. And she would do kind of a dramatic pause. Were you good at it? And usually they'd say, yeah, I was, until I got caught. And say, well, what were you good at? Well, I knew the value of my product. I understood my customer base, and everything that he rattled off, she said, oh, that's great. We're just going to transfer that over here to something legal. But the thing about that really moved me is that, I tell people all the time, one of the terms that's really hard for me is outreach, right? The idea of outreach. I've been outreach to, and I know it's often coming from a good place, but this is what outreach is, right? I'm not going to use it because I know, I've been over taking advantage of it. I just go, how you doing? I'm going to outreach to you. I said, I want you to come with me. You don't have to move. Okay. Come with me, right? I make a space for you at my table. You sit here in this chair. And then what you have to do is learn everything about how we do everything. You have to understand the language, the culture, our values, our mission statement. And actually, all we had to do was put a chair for you at the table. You actually have to do any of the work. And for me, that is not a sustainable relationship. I'm interested in relationships of reciprocity, which means that everybody has to do the work. And oh, you know what? This table may not be working at all. Well, we just have to up and get rid of this table now. Everybody needs to be uncomfortable. It means I'm recognizing that you come in a whole, complete person with knowledge and experience and things that I don't know and things that I can learn from. So I meet you where you're at on that equal ground in this way, right? Which changes. The idea of outreach for me is not about that. It comes from a good place, but for me, it doesn't actually allow you or me to actually show up as we fully are. You're not an empty vessel for me to fill up, right? It's not that at all. So what I love about the way she thought about that, she saw all these, they may have been in jail. That didn't make them any less human, full, exciting, creative people, and so she acknowledged them that way. About maybe 6 years ago, she invited me there, along with other people, to kind of speak about our experience in relating to the organization. She asked one of these young men to get up in front of the room. There's about 100 people in the room. He stood up there. He had his suit. He looked kind of uncomfortable. And the first thing out of his mouth was he said, "I never knew green could be so good to me." And we were all in the first 2 rows were in tears because green meant something else. Green, he could understand himself being part of this idea, not this idea overlaid on his life, but actually in relationship with his life, and he was something that was part of it. So the last thing I will say, I always say that and then it's like not always true, but is I want to go back to my parents a little bit and sort of the epilogue and the idea of what happened on this property. So my parents, 2003, they moved to Leesburg, Virginia, and neighbors, when anything ever happens on this property, they'll get a letter letting them know what happened there. They got a letter from one of the neighbors, and I saw the letter. It wasn't very long. It was from the Westchester, I think it's Westchester Conservation Land Trust. And the letter was going out to all the neighbors to let them know that a conservation easement had now been placed on that property. And when a conservation easement is placed on a property, it means that in perpetuity, nothing can be changed. And it was explaining to everybody, it said, about all the environmental sort of points that that property had, the wildlife that it was on the property, where it sits in the watershed, all the reasons why a conservation easement should be placed on the property. And near the end of that single-page letter, it thanked the new owner for his conservation mindedness. He'd been on the property, I think, 2 years. There was nothing in the letter thanking the people who had cared for that land for 50 years. So, and when people ask you, how do stories become invisible and people become invisible, that's how they become invisible. Just like that. Not because the people at the Westchester Conservation Land Trust are bad people. I don't think that's what it is. But there's something about whether it's their own privilege, and I always say privilege has the privilege of not seeing itself. You see what you understand and know and interact. We all do it, right? I do it too. Right? I've got privilege too, right? It kind of comes at us this way. But how fast they erased the experience of my parents loving, working, and caring for that land for 50 years. And so I'm interested really in changing that dynamic. And because I'm out of time, and you took away my final line, but you're the dean, and so because what I want to end with, it's okay. I talk a lot about risk, and we can have this conversation. About risk, because about a risk to gain, and I was talking about it earlier, we often, I find as human beings, we're willing to take a risk in order not to lose something, but for me, at this point, it's about we have to be willing to take a risk in order to gain something. Because we're really at a different place. I don't think we can hold on to everything the way it is and try to have change at the same time, or use the same tools that we always use over and over again. This is an old conversation. I think there's new ways we can be having it, but it is an old conversation. So I want to end with 2 quotes. The first is Albert Einstein, who says, "You can't solve a problem with the same consciousness that created it. You can't solve a problem with the same consciousness that created it. You can't solve a problem with the same consciousness that created it." I want to say to you, we can talk about this, and I don't want to take up space with it, but for you to understand that even for me, I got hired and recruited by an institution doing environmental work that fought over my tenure case for 3 years, and I didn't get it because they didn't like the way that I wrote this. They didn't like it. I was told right out, they said, "We don't understand the value of you citing Zora Neale Hurston or Spike Lee in your work." I mean, this kind of, we want you, but we need you like this in this conversation. That's why for me, it's always a personal conversation, even in my own privileged position as being able to intellectually engage the material, that it's real about who gets to do this, who gets to speak to it, what stories we value, who we invite in to speak, who we allow to speak, what words we use. All of it matters in this conversation. All of it matters, and I believe we all, myself included, have to continue to do that kind of self-interrogation. But my final words, what are my final words, Dean? No, you tell me, what are my final words?
I have to go back to my paper.
Yeah, you have to go back to your paper.
You know them, though. If you always do what you always did, you always get what you always got.
Yes. Thank you. What's your name?
Kimberly Mikeson. Have you reached out to the Land Trust to tell them your story?
So, I have a little interesting, so the Nature Conservancy, which is considered the biggest sort of public land that does that kind of work in the country, right, the Nature Conservancy. So they invited me to speak to their staff last summer, and I told them the story. And I've told the story 1,000 times. And at the end of it, one of the staff, an older man, stood up and said, you know what, I think we can do something about that. And I was so moved, because I never had anybody say that. So over the course of the summer, we're back and forth with emails, and they were talking about, we need to do an oral history of your parents. My dad's got early stage Alzheimer's. They're both in their mid-60s. It's like, mid-80s, I'm sorry. And so we want to capture that story. And there was the best way that I can say it, if I'm magnanimous about it, was that there was some misunderstanding, but at the end of the day, the Nature Conservancy thought they must have had some role in it because they're such a big conservation agency that they must have been involved in that acquisition. What they found out is that they weren't. So once they found out they weren't willing to put any of their resources into doing the oral history of my parents. Yeah, it was kind of, and the thing that was hard for me, I said, and this is just the very, I was like, well, they don't even see it. They said it, they don't even see it, because they were really nice people. And I didn't know how to say, it actually took me about a month before I responded in the email to find a way to say, how do I show with grace some gratefulness that they considered it, but said, this is why the narrative never changes. So if you look up how much money, it's over $900 million in Nature Conservancy. So they were talking about one videographer going out for 2 hours in the afternoon. I said, not that it should be my story, but really, where are the priorities? And they had an opportunity, even if they had nothing to do with it, to make the story part of what they could do differently. And so, I have a lot of energy on that, because it's just, I can't make them do it. But it was just so interesting to me that the initial impulse was thwarted by some kind of thinking, well, I'd have to take it to my higher up boss, and we've got to have this guy. And I'm going, well, you can't make the changes that you need to make. Right, I have a good question. Come on, I know y'all. What's your name?
Jackie Topley. Do you think that there are any racial issues in current U.S. policy with or environmental policy, how we handle national park systems, EPA?
You must know that you know what I'm going to say.
I want to learn about.
Yes.
More about it.
So yeah, well, okay. I'm not going to be flip or glib, right? I'm not a policy, political person. Okay, I watch the news. I read this stuff and I talk about it. So it's important that I say that I have served on the National Parks Advisory Board for 8 years, so I have this ability to back. I'm going to have my back to all of you. I had an opportunity to actually look at this stuff in a very particular way. I don't even know how to say this. Race, all that cannot be separate. How can it be separate? This country was built. Look, this country was built on, we exterminated a bunch of people and took them off their land in order to get that land, and then we put another group of people property to build up that land so we would have the economy that we have now. That's what we did. We collectively did that. So race has everything to do with every single piece of legislation we have ever passed, whether it's direct or indirect. And you're talking about human beings, so we can talk about these entities, but we're talking about human beings that come in with cultural beliefs and sets of values and understandings and experiences, and they bring all of that to bear upon trying to understand this. So you may or may not know this, but I was on the National Parks Advisory Board for 8 years, and 2 weeks ago we all collectively resigned. Right? We did it. Most of our terms were up anyway in 4 months, but what's supposed to happen, when the National Parks Advisory Board has been around since 1935. Sometimes it's really active under some administrations, sometimes not so much. It's not a job, it's service where you're a citizen, you don't get paid anything, you're volunteering your time. Under the previous administration, there was this real push that the Park Service was really concerned about its own relevancy. So this larger question about the country looks different, how do we retain that relevancy? Because public lands is about the public, right? We pay our taxes, we visit, we look for jobs. If we don't care about the public lands, they're not going to be cared for, and they understand we have to appeal to a broader range of people. So we were looking at everything from education, the role of education, bringing science back to the parks, issue of diversity, an issue of history, vision for the Park Service, philanthropy. 8 years, and we engaged a whole lot of other folks in order to do this. They were putting in their free time to do this and help move the Park Service forward, because all we can do is advise, and so many people who work within the Park Service are overworked. They've got all the stuff they can do, and there's only so much they can do because it's federal. It's a federal agency. Do I need to say any more about that? You know, even people within the agency, it's just like trying to turn the Titanic to try to shift the agency to think differently, so it takes time. What should have happened last year when the new administration came in at the end of 2016, we should have had our two meetings, because the other thing that we're mandated to do is affirm or confirm new national landmarks. I mean, that's all part of what we do. Over the 8 years that I was on the board, it was 130 new national landmarks and historical landmarks that we affirmed. The new Secretary of the Interior should have met with us. The new Secretary of the Interior should have said, oh, let me hear what you've been doing. And look, they have a right to bring in new people. That's how it rolls. You know, that's how we roll in this country. You bring in new people, but you want to keep up some of that momentum, or at the very least recognize that. We couldn't get a single meeting. We didn't do anything in 2017, which meant all the committees underneath, all the communities that were doing work, all of it had to get halted. All of it. All of that work. When you have things like, the CDC, you can't use the word diversity. When you take climate change out of you can't use the phrase climate change. So, yes, it absolutely has something to do with, you know, who's in power at any time, who has the privilege of making decisions. When the new secretary seems to be unilaterally making decisions about ending the plastic bottle ban, where we might consider drilling, all of those things without conferring with anybody else. The key word here is public, right? That is not, for me, I'd say it to him politely, but I'd say it's not your right to make that decision on your own, right? It's actually, we're all here should be part of that decision, and everyone won't be pleased. Right? It's not about pleasing everyone, but the scary part is when you no longer want to have a conversation with us about it. And then even the response of the Interior was just this, that we're all quitters, and it was just mortified. I said, what you should have just said at bare minimum was just thank you for your service. Because, you know, in terms of really, when we think about wanting citizens to get involved, you know, what's going to make any citizen want to get involved like that? So I know I just went off, I went far and wide, but yes, my answer to your question.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Yeah, what's your name?
Joshua Hodge.
Joshua.
It's a quick question, probably, but do you have a favorite U.S. national park, and if so, why?
I actually, you know, the thing I was just doing yesterday, I can't pick one, but what I would say is I lived in Utah for 2 years. It's where I did my master's, and you know, I had some challenges in Utah. I like to say I was diversity. I'm living in Logan, Utah. You know what I'm saying? But Zion and Canyonlands, I still think that's the most beautiful part of the country I've ever seen. Like, that just blew my mind. So that just, it surprised me, you know, because I lived in Utah with my own set of biases, and to see that beauty. But I often also tell the story of the Martin Luther King National Park, because for me, parks aren't only in Yosemite, Grand Canyon, Yellowstone, Zion, right? It's actually a lot of the parks where people live. They're sort of living and breathing. They're in cities, you know. They're parks as well. You know, I tell people, are you breathing? You have a relationship with nature, doesn't matter where you're at. You know, this whole human-nature separation makes me nuts, but that's another conversation for another day. So that's my answer to you. All right, is that satisfactory? Hi, what's your name?
I'm Glennis. What work are you doing with children? What are you doing for the next generation?
I'm not sure what you're doing for the next generation. Probably not enough, but so what's been really interesting about this journey, because I've sort of it's been accidental for me, is discovering what is it that I do well. Like, how do I not perpetuate certain ways of thinking about it and coming at it myself, what serves. The audiences that invite me in tend to be audiences like this, or predominantly white environmental organizations, or students. So I work a lot with students, but I know you said children and then next generation, so I know people who do work for children, or work with children. I guess I would be the person who would work with the people who work with children, right? In terms of thinking about just how we frame that, and questions of outreach. This idea of bringing the urban, which is always code usually for black and brown kids, to the park, and that's a great idea. But then what happens when you take them home? And so I would work with them in thinking about what it is they're doing and where they're doing it. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yeah. What's your name? What's your name, next generation? Coleman?
Colvin.
Coleman? Coleman.
Colby.
Colby. Yeah, Colby.
How was it for you when you went to college?
Woo, Colby. How was it for me in high school and college? You mean just in general? High school. Nobody's ever asked me that question. Taking me back, Colby. High school, I went to Mamaroneck High School. Mamaroneck is a public school. There's like 3,000 kids, a lot of wealthy families in the area, right? So the actor Matt Dillon? I went to high school with Matt Dillon. He was a few years younger. So you got lawyers and a lot of people in the school, a lot of money. A very small group of African American students there, right? So I was already having problems with Marion Mitchell and Darlene Robinson, right? And we all went to high school. And the problem for me, there's a lot about high school I liked. It's when I discovered theater. I used to be a runner. There's all this stuff, the socializing, and I got along with a lot of different groups. We call them the AWOL, the Greasers, the 70s. There was all these names, the jocks. I got along with a lot of people. But I didn't get along with a handful of African American students, not all of them, that really gave me every single day. One of the things about, sometimes if I walked by here before homeroom, that I can't tell you how many times I was called the N-word by black students. And this is the conversation we also don't often have, right? And getting that, and it wasn't until I was a senior in high school, I'm a bit slow sometimes. But the last time they did it, I turned around and I said, "Who the F are you calling the N?" And I said that, and I said it, I had it, and after that I was like, "Hi Carolyn, how are you doing today?" I was like, that's all I had to do was stand up here for a long time ago. So I struggled with my own sense of identity. I remember when I was right after I was 9, 10, I had worn 2 pigtails, but I wanted straight hair. Right? This is an old, this is the 60s into the 70s. And I asked my mother, I begged her if she would straighten my hair. And the products that they had then weren't as good as the hair products they have now. And she knew, I was like, I'm gonna get my hair, I'm gonna be able to do this, hair's gonna do this. And of course, when she did my hair, that's not what happened. So then I had to cut it all off. I said, just cut it off. So from 4th grade until almost a senior in high school, I had an afro. So I had this weird thing because I got along really well with white students. I had my best friend was Jewish. My first boyfriend was Jewish. But this made it complicated for me. It made it complicated. It made it complicated with my father because, I can tell you a story. I went to the prom with this black guy who I barely knew. I messed up with the guy who I should have gone with. Made me kind of a bad person, but because I was so unsure about who am I supposed to be and how am I supposed to show up as a black person here. What does that even mean to look like me? My father was so all the time, you need to read the autobiography of Malcolm X. I didn't read it until I was 34 because my dad got on my case. Now I think it's a great book, but that's another story. So it was challenging. I was stressed a lot. I had a lot of stress, but my stress was over. I wanted to be liked. I wanted people to think that I was fun and I got along, but I was balancing this idea of what does it mean for me to be black. When I was 15, 17 magazine. Call me. You're good. 17 magazine came to our high school and they were looking for regular girls to be in their issue. Now this was like 75, right? So you have to think about it's different than it is today in many ways. And I didn't care. I was rehearsing a play. I wasn't going to go and try to be in it. And somebody came and said, you should go do it. And in the end, right, and I had this big afro, I got in the magazine and I ended up doing stuff for them for a few years after that. And I never really wanted to tell anybody. That's a whole other thing. But so I gained in popularity, but the issue of race didn't shift. It was a weird, because it was like, so this general popularity because you want to be popular in high school, but the issue of race was always embedded in there. So when I would audition for school plays, There's a play called about the life of Helen Keller and Annie Sullivan, and how Helen Keller was blind and
Miracle Worker.
the what?
Miracle
The Miracle Worker, right? And when I auditioned, because it's based on a true story, the only part that I could do was the maid. But my father wouldn't let me play it because it was the maid. And it was hard because, you know, as a creative person, actually, you can bring great humanity to that role. But of course, I couldn't say that when I was like 14 to my dad. I mean, he's like, no, you're not playing the maid. It's not happening. So it was complicated, right? There was times I had a lot of fun. There was times I was really confused. My guidance counselor didn't do a lot in terms of thinking about where I might consider going to college. That was really, you know, I did well in school. It was complicated how to read all of that. The thing that saved me most of all was I had great friends. At 16, I was planning to run away from home because my father just made me crazy, right? Because he was living in fear. He was living in fear of what would happen to me, but that's another thing that I didn't understand. And it was one of my best friends who said, you know, you just gotta last one more year, don't run away. So friends are it comes back to relationship, right? So it's about the friends you have, right? Is that good, Colby? Yeah, surprise. So he just took me down memory lane, and I'm like, woo, okay.
Let's have one more question, and then we can continue the questions. But I know Carolyn hasn't had dinner, I haven't had dinner, and a lot of us are hungry. So one more question, then we'll move to the back.
Two more. I want to get her, but I want to get him too.
Okay.
Okay, sorry, I just usurped you and stuff like that. All right. What's your name?
Susan.
Susan.
What happened in Nepal?
Ah, you mean just in general?
Well,
That I wasn't there, huh?
they turned you around and sent you the direction you're
There was 5 years of me backpacking when I was leaving acting, deciding to go back to school. I would save my money and then I would go backpacking for months. And during one of those periods, I went to Nepal and I lived in a village for a year and a half just to do it. So that's where I fell in love with the country, right? I love that place, right? And so then when I did my master's, I went there. I was working under like a German forestry project, and that was my master's. So by the time I got to the Ph.D., it's like I was going to go back again and just keep, because I could go back there and continue that work. But so if you're asking me what turned me around, it was in part that year that I went over, that summer, the royal family had just been assassinated in Nepal. So it was 2001. I'm studying Nepali at Cornell University. The royal family has been assassinated. The week I was supposed to fly over was 9/11. Right? Just the day before, I'd just been visiting my parents in New York, right? It was just, so I didn't go anywhere for a few weeks and didn't want to leave. But who turns down a Fulbright? So then I went over. I decided, because my work was, you know, horseshoe. We talked earlier today with somebody about that. There's a horseshoe. It's called the Annapurna Conservation Area is one big horseshoe. It takes you about 3 weeks to trek the whole thing. The highest point is 17,000 feet. The village where I was doing my work was at Marfa, which is at 10,000 feet. So I went to hike the whole thing to see it all before I began. The day that I came off that 3-week trek, a group called the Maoists broke a ceasefire that had been in place for years. The State Department then didn't want any of its people, citizens, students, out in these rural areas because they can't keep track of you, even though they weren't targeting foreigners. And so for about another 7 months, because I was sharing an apartment with some other Fulbrighters in Kathmandu in the capital city, but I could only get back out to the field site once for a week. So even though I had started thinking about what was happening with my parents, I said, I'm going to do race and environment. This will be like a postdoc thing or something. I suddenly realized it didn't look like I was going to get to finish my dissertation. You know, so then I just came back, and my advisor agreed. And I spent a whole other year writing a whole new dissertation proposal. And I got fairly depressed because, you know, if you have to write one once, you get depressed. You have to write one twice. It's like, you know. And then I got more funding than I could ever imagine, and then that just changed my life around. But that's, you know, that's what happened. Thank you. But the last one was you. What's your name?
My name's
Jabari?
Tafari.
Tafari.
Yeah. So I actually have 2 questions, but
No, really?
I'll let you
Just go ahead.
I'll let you just pick, I guess.
Okay.
So
He guesses. He's just going to let me pick.
well, so the first one is I'm curious. So at Texas State, we've been dealing with issues where we really don't have like a lot of black professors at all.
Yeah.
And so the question is about how important do you feel it is that it's you, especially when you're talking, like you mentioned before, where a lot of times you're making presentations for like predominantly white audiences, predominantly white institutions. So how important do you think that it's you as a black woman?
Let me answer that question first, because I don't want to forget what you just said. Was that the end of it?
Yeah.
Yeah, then, because I saw you getting ready to go to the other one. So, wow, that's a good question. Yeah. As a person who went through back to school for 3 degrees, I only ever had one, and he was an African professor at the University of Minnesota in an exchange program. I never had an African American faculty person ever. The graduate program had no African American studies programs. Now I believe, like I showed you my metaphorical afro, and I learned from everybody, and actually how important it is to see someone who looks like you. Because there's something about the embodied experience. You know, if we accept the difficult fact that in this country we don't value everybody the same way, in part because we look different, right? It's embedded in everything I just talked about, right? The power of having someone who potentially might understand that thing that's difficult to articulate, I'm not saying if someone looks like you, they're going to be nice to you or they're necessarily going to understand you, but there's something, like at least my experience of academia, about what that means. I know when any student of any walk of life comes into my office, I'm open. And I also know there's something about when a brown or black student walks in, and sometimes there's that thing that we don't have to explain it, but I can kind of support what I understand as how do you self-care? How do you self-care for yourself in an environment that doesn't always recognize you and doesn't always value you and see you? It's not about saying that everybody around here is racist and everybody's bad. I don't find any of that useful. What I find useful for is how you can take care of yourself and be seen and be whole. And having said that, too, and I feel badly, but I just officially resigned from my full-time position because I can't spend any more energy fighting the institution for my right to be who I am in this space and do the work that I do. I want to just be able to do the work. So I still want to work, just like this, but I have to do it from outside of the institution. So, and for those of us who are the only one in your department, that gets old after a while. Doesn't mean everybody in your department isn't great. But students, I think it's important because I think you're looking at us to see how we're handling the situation. Like, how are we handling it? It's an example, it's an opportunity for you to kind of see, and that you can actually do it if this is what you want to do. And I would say to you, but it's not what you have to do, right? And there's a different way that I just really understand how you might sort of frame your world. So it's incredibly important, this whole idea of hiring people and putting people in place. Difference isn't only about skin color, it's also about how we show up, how we learn, how we share, and that just, for me, everybody benefits. Sometimes I don't fully understand why we're so scared. We're so scared of no longer being comfortable. Well, welcome to my world and a whole lot of other people in this room, right? And this is not about being comfortable, this is about being better. How are we better? I want you to be better, and I want you to be better, and I want to be better at that. So yeah, it is really important. You better ask that second question now, because I'm about to get really emotional.
My second question was, how do you address the accessibility of conservation and environmentalism? So the thing that's coming to mind is when we think about hiking and we think about Colorado, and that's a really casual pastime for a lot of white people.
Yeah.
But it's not really as approachable for black communities.
Yeah.
So I wonder if that's something that
yeah, especially with environmental organizations. Well, so I want to reframe, that's a great question. I want to reframe it a little bit and say that, so one of the things when I was interviewing black people for this book, it was in Florida, I met a man who told me that there is something called the Black Brother, not organization, of the Black Brotherhood of Skiers. There's a whole long name to it. It's supposed to be the oldest ski organization in the country, the Black Brotherhood of Skiers. I was like, hey, what? And you're in Florida, what's happening? And he would tell me stories like once they had 6,000 of them descended on Vail, Colorado. And for a moment, like, it was freaking everybody out. Right? Black people on the slopes, and who was serving who in the restaurant, yeah, right? It was messing up, it was playing. So I say that because it actually messed with my sense of what is really accessible. And sometimes I think we've been fed a little bit of a myth that it's not, actually, because black people, pretty much like everyone else, have been everywhere and done everything. So sometimes it's that visibility. But I think what you're pointing at is the idea that conservation, these things, activities are framed in very particular ways. You have to have this kind of gear. Here's who's going. This is what it looks like. You gotta hike like this. You gotta do like, right?
I've never been skipped.
Yeah, there's a whole kind of thing to it that may not be who you are. Oftentimes, when I purposefully, sometimes I make the choice to dress the way that I do on purpose, to say, like, it's not about you have to show up in Gore-Tex. I mean, I'm not saying you don't need the right equipment for some of the things that we do in the outdoors. That's not what I'm saying. But accessibility is also about, for me, the people who are putting these activities together, how accessible they are to a different way of experiencing and showing up in these spaces. And that how everybody communes with nature looks different, right? And so, and it goes back to your very first question when you were asking about how important is it to have an African-American professor, somebody who looks, like some other students in the classroom. The same for the environmental organizations. I say to them, you want to connect to these communities who look different than you, then you got to get some other people who look like those community members in leadership positions to be with you. So it's a relationship building. It's not simply you doing all the good stuff for everybody else. Actually, you got to change up the game, and maybe you have to step aside because you're not that good at it. That doesn't mean you don't become irrelevant. You're not the best person to do that job. I always ask, what is your intention? Is your intention to really embrace and engage and change the way that you do things? If it is, then you got to change the way you do things, which means you may have to change who's actually doing those things in the first place. Did I do good?
Let's give Dr. Carolyn Finney